I want you to take just a moment and notice the screen. And normally I don't typically cite Wikipedia as a source, but if you check the numbers, the graph actually works in relationship to the numbers, so they are accurate. And I want to let that sink in for just a moment. You can see in red Roe v. Wade, that's the number of deaths as a result of Roe versus Wade. And then you see the Civil War, World War II, World War I, and on down the line. Let that sink in for just a moment. In Columbus, Ohio, recently a federal judge blocked Ohio officials from enforcing state law stopping 3 Planned Parenthood abortion clinics from illegally dumping aborted babies in local landfills. According to Stephen Ertelt of Life News, the Planned Parenthood abortion business, whose 3 clinics were caught illegally dumping at landfills, filed a lawsuit against state officials claiming the investigations that resulted in catching the abortion businesses were politically motivated. I would pause and simply say, does that really make a difference? Even if the investigations were politically motivated, if they were breaking the law, does that make a difference? Planned Parenthood, you should remember, was caught breaking multiple state and federal laws when they were caught offering to sell body parts of aborted babies. Ohio's Attorney General Mike DeWine noted that the abortion providers paid to have aborted babies steam cooked before dumping them in landfills. The Attorney General said, disposing of aborted fetuses from an abortion by sending them to a landfill is callous and completely inhumane. I totally agree. However, I don't think it should come as a surprise that this is going on. If we devalue life to the degree that our nation does, what's the big deal about what is done with the remains of the physical body after the baby's life is taken? Now, certainly it is a big deal. But why should we be surprised if we're willing to take the baby's life? Why would we be surprised what people are willing to do with the remains? That we legally take the lives of innocent children is the bigger issue, isn't it? And yet so many in our nation don't want to have that conversation. It's the equivalent of turning the television channel when the ads come on for starving children. We have this idea, if we don't have to see it, it doesn't happen. If we don't talk about it, it's not happening. Out of sight, out of mind. Now, I know that many of you have been following the national discussion about gun control. We're often told that if the laws were stricter, the violence would go down. The problem with that is very simple. It assumes that violent criminals are willing to obey the laws of the land. It's the equivalent of saying, we put padlocks on the lockers in federal penitentiary so that no prisoners will steal from each other. Locks, as the old saying goes, are for honest people. It's the nonviolent model citizen types that obey the laws. Do you think for 1 minute that drug lords, pimps, and robbers care about what laws are on the books? Do you think that really matters to them? Now, should there be laws in place that govern the purchase and use of guns, and laws in place that punish those who get them or use them illegally? Absolutely. No problem with that whatsoever. But just like there were abortions before it was legal, there are gun deaths caused by guns that were illegally purchased, and certainly they are used illegally. I have to say, I appreciate the meme I've seen on social media that says, sorry, but I don't listen to anti-gun lectures from people who think it's okay to kill a baby. My point in bringing up the gun issue is because, just like abortion, it illustrates a reality. The reality that we have violence in America, the reason we have violence in America is not because of laws, it's not because of the lack of laws. The reason we have violence and killing and abortion and robbing in American streets is because it's not because we don't have laws on the books, it's because we don't have God in our hearts. So here's the point, and it's the title of the message today. It's an issue of the heart from Jeremiah chapter 17, and I'll invite you to stand as we look at that text together. Jeremiah chapter 17, beginning with verse 5. Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart runs away from the Lord. He is like a shrub in the desert and shall not see any good come. He shall dwell in the parched places of the wilderness. in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. Like the partridge that gathers a brood that she did not hatch, so is he who gets riches, but not by justice. Parenthetically, that's an anti-lottery biblical text. In the midst of his days, they will leave him, and at his end, he will be a fool. A glorious throne set on high from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be put to shame. Those who turn away from you shall be written in the earth, for they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living water. Thank you so much. You may be seated. If you've been here very much, you know normally how this works in this place. Typically, I exegete a text of Scripture and I teach it. I study to teach that particular text and all the implications. That's the norm, and I think, by the way, that's the best possible scenario in the worship life of a church. But this morning, I'm not so much going to be exegeting the text as I am simply taking our time to illustrate what the text very clearly teaches. The fact that we have to talk about the sanctity of human life in a so-called civilized culture is indicative of the reality that Jeremiah highlighted so long ago. It's found in chapter 17 and verse 9, where he says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it?" The heart, which was the ancients' way of saying the mind and the will, is deceitful above all things. Let's come to grips with that. Understanding that biblical truth will change your life and, in fact, could change the world. Apart from the direct intervention of God in my heart, my proclivity is always toward deception and evil. So is yours. It's the world into which we're born and the nature with which we're born when we're born. The heart is deceptive above all. Who can understand it? So, while we can work to have laws on the books to protect people, which is the government's main job, people don't change unless their hearts change. And our hearts are changed when we experience grace through faith in Jesus. So what does a changed heart look like, and what in the world does that have to do with the issue of the sanctity of human life? Just two main thoughts this morning. First of all, recognize a changed heart recognizes the sin of taking innocent human life. A changed heart recognizes the sin of taking innocent human life. Let me be clear. There are people who have a moral compass that are not Christians. There are those who are unbelievers that understand the truth about the abortion industry. There are a lot of non-believers, non-Christians, who know that it's wrong to take innocent life and know that it's wrong not to protect innocent life. You don't have to be a Christian to believe in the sanctity of life, just like you don't have to be a Christian to believe in the sanctity of marriage. There are a lot of unbelievers, a lot of non-Christians who understand marriage ought to be for a man and a woman, period. They get that. Sanctity just means sacred. The idea that we recognize the sacredness of life and we value life. While I would not advocate the killing of animals for no reason at all, and I'm not in favor of any kind of cruelty to animals, we recognize that animal life is not the same as human life. We are not, contrary to what you may have been taught, we are not just another animal on the planet that has somehow managed to communicate more intricately than our dogs do. We are human beings made in the very image of God. Unfortunately, our kids have been taught that they're just evolving. They're just nothing more than a compilation of chance occurrences that caused them to become people on planet Earth. You can see how that concept alone devalues humanity. And I'm not trying to convince unbelievers. Let me be clear about that. I know that that an unbeliever is not going to look at what Jeremiah says about the heart and say, well, there you go. I'm thankful for that argument. Now I understand. Thank you for clearing that up for me. I'm here to convince believers about this. For Christians, we have a book that guides our lives, right? We have a book that guides our lives. And in the very first book of this book we call the Bible, the first book in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, makes it clear that people are created in the image of God. We are God's image bearers. Solomon makes it clear in the book of Ecclesiastes that there is, in fact, a time to be born and there's a time to die. And implicit in Solomon's writing is that that time is to be left to God. And I am not denying, by the way, that the Bible makes a case for just war and that there are times, certainly, that it approves the taking of human life, for example, in defending oneself. But the overall tenor of the Scripture is that life is God's to give and God's to take away, not ours. And here's what you'll find among people who are believers that are pro-choice. Typically, they're pro-choice and they're also very uncomfortable if homosexuality is viewed negatively, much less preached against. The two often, not always, but often go hand in hand in their theology. Don't talk about abortion because we don't want to deal with that. Don't talk about homosexuality because we don't want to deal with that either. And you will find them generally to be in favor of gay marriage. And essentially, oftentimes, they're universalists. They really don't believe that God would ever allow people to go to hell no matter what the people believe or don't believe or what they do or don't do, because after all, they've already signed off on the fact that immorality is okay. So they're saying that what somebody does or doesn't do, what they believe or don't believe, in the eyes of God is really not that big of a deal. And I'm here to tell you, it is that big of a deal. Let me reiterate, we're called to love everyone. As Christians, we do not have the right to harbor hatred toward those who are in favor of gay marriage or those who are in favor of abortion and so forth. Just because we believe something is immoral doesn't mean we hate the people who embrace the immorality. We cannot hate people with whom we disagree. That's not right. Hatred is the outgrowth also of living with a deceptive heart. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. And if we hate other people, we are essentially confessing that we are living with a deceived heart. In fact, if you hate everybody with whom you disagree, I suspect your circle of friends and loved ones is pretty small. I applaud my liberal friends, and I don't mean liberal in a pejorative term. I mean it in the way that they self-identify as liberal. I applaud my liberal friends for their conviction to love the marginalized or the outcasts in our society, but the problem is they're not consistent. In fact, the courts in the United States of America are not consistent. Abortion is still legal in America, and yet if a person takes the life of a woman who is carrying a baby, in many cases, he can be charged with the murder of the woman as well as the murder of the child. Where's the consistency in that? In fact, if liberalism remained consistent, then liberals would be the ones leading the charge to protect the unborn and the elderly. If they were consistent about their liberal beliefs. As it is, they are the ones protecting the front lines of the abortion industry. And with both parties, and let me be very clear here, with both political parties, people continue backing legislation that makes it more difficult for the elderly to be cared for with the measure of care that human beings deserve. Both of our political parties should be working together to make medication affordable for senior citizens. That's an issue of the sanctity of life. In fact, I would submit to you this morning that in America, with so much in terms of resources, it ought to be a crime that our elderly have to make a decision each month whether to pay their rent or purchase their medication. That's criminal in America, don't you think? And contrary to what some believe, the Affordable Health Care Act does not make things better for some of the most vulnerable in our culture. I'm not going to give you the personal particulars, but with a dad who is 87, I tell you, I know what I'm talking about. Tests that need to be run or procedures that are needed to help the elderly shouldn't be approved or denied based solely on their cost. And doctors who have sworn an oath to bring healing when possible, doctors, not insurance companies, should make these calls. These are people we're talking about. They're not animals. They're people created in the image of God. And our politicians are literally signing off on their death warrants. So why talk about this issue in the first place? I promise you, I don't like to have to talk about this any more than probably you enjoy hearing this. But we as people of faith need the constant reminder that although the people of God understand these issues for the most part, there are people all around us who simply buy into whatever they're being told. And the arguments I submit to you in favor of abortion, for example, are fanciful. We'll get to those in a moment. So first we see a changed heart recognizes the sin of taking innocent human life. Secondly, I want you to see it is the deceptive heart that alibis in opposition to God's Word. I am certain there are those in our church family who have been touched by abortion. And let me be very clear. My goal is not to heap guilt upon anybody who may have been involved with an abortion in any way, but rather to help those who might someday be faced with that decision to make the right and righteous choice. In other words, we need to speak the truth in love, absolutely, but make no mistake, we still need to speak the truth. So what's the answer? Well, there are a lot of answers, perhaps. I would simply encourage you to give, as we're going to make available the opportunity for you to do that this morning. Give to pro-life causes like the Liberty Women's Clinic. Give to the Missouri Baptist Children's Home. Adopt a child if God would lead you to do that. Certainly encourage those who are in challenging circumstances with their children. But we need to still speak the truth about this. And let me be very clear, abortion is not a gray area. I'm going to say it again. Abortion is not a gray area. There is no in between. Either a child is alive or a child dies. There is no gray area when it comes to the existence of a child. Think with me about the flaws logically to the abortion arguments. Many people say, well, a woman's body belongs to her. Well, let's clarify. Nobody in American society has complete control over his or her body in the sense that we can do whatever we want to do with our body. For example, if I decide to drink alcoholic beverages and get in my car and drive down the road and I'm pulled over, the police officer, the person who is in charge of arresting me for breaking the law, is not going to say, oh, don't worry about it, Ken. It's your body that you ingested the alcohol into. It's okay because you have complete control over your body. Do with it whatever you will. No, that's not the way it works, is it? I'll be arrested and I'll be given a driving while intoxicated citation. A body with chicken pox is not allowed in a classroom. As Christians, Paul reminds us, you are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. Unbelievers may hold to that argument about it's my body, I can do with it whatever I want to, but believers in good conscience cannot. We do not belong to ourselves. We belong to Him. Right? So a lot of people alibi that argument. It's a woman's choice. The second argument in favor of abortion is the child isn't wanted. And at this point, typically there are two things that are brought up, the issue of rape and then the issue of economics. A child who is conceived in a situation of rape, as terrible as that is, and I have no idea what that would be like to have to go through, but the child who is conceived under those circumstances is innocent, and the child is not to blame for how his life begins. Or people say if a couple can't afford a child, they ought to abort. I'm 50 years old and my kids are essentially on their own and I still can't afford my children. People say, well, it's better that a child not be brought into the world if his parents don't want him. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not in any way trying to downplay or discount the issues of abuse or neglect that an unwanted child might have to live with, and that is awful. My point is this: even if a child is not wanted by his parents, if they will either A, give that child up for adoption, or B, allow that child the opportunity to live, at a certain point, in most cases, he will find himself away from his parents that didn't want him in the first place, and then he at least has a chance to begin living the way God created human beings to live. The reason it's not right to say that abortion is justified in the case of an unwanted child is at least twofold. First, we don't know the eventual outcome of a child's life. He may be on the streets at 15. Maybe his life was horrific leading up to the age of 15, and I'm not trying to downplay that, but maybe it was awful up until age 15, and at 15 he finds himself on the streets, and that's terrible. But he might be a missionary at 25, and that's wonderful. It's not our place to determine who lives and who dies based on what we think are bad circumstances. Quality of life as it relates to determining who should be born is an argument with terrible logical conclusions. And again, I remind us, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. If we take that thinking that I just mentioned a moment ago to its logical conclusion, then fat people should be killed. Because a lot of fit people don't think fat people have a good enough quality of life. That's the truth. Low IQ people should be killed because high IQ people think that low IQ people won't have a good enough quality of life. Let's just kill everybody that doesn't graduate from college. Let's kill everybody that doesn't graduate from graduate school. What kind of sense does that make? But that is their sense taken to the logical conclusion. And the reason they take that step of understanding or that belief system is because the heart is deceitful above all things. What about those with birth defects? That is always an argument that the pro-choice people mention. They say a child should not have to live with such defects. Well, which defect is the game changer? If you're missing a toe, should you not have been allowed to live? What about a finger or a hand or an arm? What is the defect that is so bad that a child shouldn't be allowed to be born or an adult shouldn't be allowed to continue living? What's so bad? Which one is it? Listen, friends, as ridiculous as this may sound to some, we are not that far. We are not very far removed from the ideology of none other than Adolf Hitler, who said it was his role to determine what kind of class of citizenry should continue to exist. That's exactly what we're doing in America with the plight of abortion. So yes, life is extremely hard for some people because of their circumstances, but they still have life. And what, after all, is 9 months or 15 years or 20 years even in light of forever? Everything we face, every challenge we face, even the unthinkable type, can be used by God in some way. And those challenges don't diminish our worth as people. There's purpose even in suffering. Even if you had to suffer as a little child until you could break away from those abusive patterns, I'm still grateful you were given life. I don't understand, let me be clear, I don't understand why some have to suffer. But I'm glad, even so, that those who have had to suffer are allowed to live. Dr. John Piper brings great perspective at this point. He writes, "Not only is all your affliction momentary, not only is all your affliction light in comparison to eternity and the glory there, but all of it is totally meaningful. Every millisecond of your pain from the fallen nature or fallen man, every millisecond of your misery in the path of obedience is producing a peculiar glory you will get because of that. I don't care if it was cancer or criticism. I don't care if it was slander or sickness. It wasn't meaningless. It's doing something. It's not meaningless. Of course you can't see what it's doing. Don't look at what is seen. When your mom dies, when your kid dies, when you got cancer at 40, when a car careens into the sidewalk and takes her out, don't say, that's meaningless. It's not. It's working for you an eternal weight of glory. Therefore, do not lose heart, but take these truths and day by day focus on them. Preach them to yourself every morning. Get alone with God and preach His Word into your mind until your heart sings with confidence that you are new and cared for." The pro-abortion position is illogical. If taken to the extremes, we recognize that it's illogical. And let me say this, and for a believer, it's unthinkable. In fact, though many would disagree with me at this point, I would simply say it is a first-order doctrine. What I mean by that is this. It's not like eschatology, where we can debate when Jesus will return to receive the church. Either we believe that God is the creator of life and the one who has the only one who has the right to bring life and end life, or we don't. And the Bible makes it clear that God is the one who gives life. It's His right, it's His prerogative. So what I would say to you is, when the day comes and you move away and you have to find another church, when you talk to a pastor about his beliefs, you ought to ask him three things. Ask him what he believes about the physical bodily resurrection of Christ, and then ask him if he believes an axe head actually floated, because if he says no, he's a pastor that's not worth his salt. And then you need to ask him what he believes and what his church believes about the sacredness of life. Because if he gets that wrong, I guarantee he'll get a lot more wrong. If you don't believe in the sanctity of life, then why would you believe in the cross? If life isn't important, then why did Jesus come and die so that people might live? What kind of sense does that even make? It all falls apart there unless we understand the sacred nature of life as a gift from our Creator God. That's not rocket science. Now, is it? Keep in mind everything I've taught you today. I want to tell you a story about a young man who lived in the Midwest. This story could be repeated, I'm sure, countless times. His parents were young and really didn't have a whole lot of money, but they were very grateful that the young wife was pregnant. There were some challenges in the pregnancy itself. The doctor said that the couple could be, quote, cautiously optimistic about the birth of the child. The couple hoped for the best and they prayed. They had great joy at the thought of adding to their little family. And then the day came, because of some complications they were facing in the pregnancy, that the doctor, in the midst of an appointment, grimly said something like this. He said, "You know, there are other options you could consider." And the couple said, "No, we'll take our chances and we'll be grateful for whatever God gives us." And they didn't look back. So the little boy, whose parents had been given the option, whose doctor said that the couple could be cautiously optimistic, that little boy was born, and he grew up, and he brought great pride and joy to his parents. And now he's a sheriff's deputy. That little boy, some were ready to discard, is my son.